start by suggesting we shake our hands a little, like trees. Yeah, try not to wallop your neighbor, but just get that energy moving and lift up your arms and feel your feet planted, and you are utterly beautiful to look at right now. And take a deep breath. Oh, thank you. I'm going to be joined later on stage by the amazing Wendy Davis, who just a few miles from here is doing the real work of putting her hands in the earth with these amazing school children, 4 of whom will be getting very fortunate to hear their stories later today, planting trees. So I'm going to start us off, and then we're going to go into a conversation and really a storytelling process with these amazing, happens to be young women. So how I do not get introduced nowadays is as a branding expert. But before I had a sort of spiritual awakening and an environmental awakening, I earned my living as a copywriter, copy editor, and a brander. And I worked for one of the top branding agencies in America, and we would have these mega companies come to us, and they didn't even have a finished product, but they would say to us, create a story for this product, for whatever it is you think it should be, and we'll create the product to fit the story. So what I took from that is that story is really, really powerful. So fast forward many years later, and I'm now using language in, for me, a more soulful way as a poetry and journal therapist, and really using that work to connect nature here with nature there, really just one nature. And I'm reading a stunning book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. If you haven't read it, write it down, it's so good. And in it, she describes a man called Gary Nahab, who does a lot of nature writing. And he says, before we can restore the land, we need to re-story the land. We need to listen to the land's stories. And I think Isabella Tree this morning gave us just the most perfect example of that. But Robin Wall Kimmerer asks, who will tell those stories? So what I'm hoping is that we will all be those storytellers. So today I want to come at restoring through 3 sort of lenses. One is that we're always living a story. A story is a cosmology, it's a worldview, it's how we make sense of who we are and what we're here to do. And whether we know it or not, everything is driven by the story. So story, if you want to change the world, you have to change the story. 2, imagination, deep imagination, is absolutely key to this. And the problem is we live in a world that has turned imagination into fantasy, not that important, great for young children, let's get real. But we have to bring back imagination. And this is incredibly important in our school systems. Because you see, the thing is, if we can't reimagine the world, if we can't bring back imagination, all we're doing is educating our children to support the existing structure, which is destroying the earth. And the third thing is that, you know, the story of humans are inextricably interwoven into the story of forests and trees. And so perhaps the forests also hold a model for the kind of stories that we might be telling. And I want to begin with a story. So I grew up in London, quite close to Holland Park. And Holland Park, when I was a little girl, was an absolute wilderness. And my friend Jane and I, aged 7 years old, 7 years old, loved to go into the park as twilight was falling. And this is in the early 1960s. And then they used to ring a bell to announce the closing of the park. And Jane and I would get as close to the center of the park in the deepest, darkest place that we could, hoping really in our heart of hearts that we would be locked in this magical forest overnight. And this place of the forest was so different from this orderly world that I lived in, of bells and nap times and all of these things that seemed to dominate my life. And I felt, I couldn't have said it back then, but I felt this incredible sense of aliveness, of magic, of enchantment in this place. And later, when I left the world of copywriting and branding and all that in the early 2000s and came to do my own writing, my own creative work, I felt that I was brought back into that dark, magical forest place again. That kind of place where you can't quite navigate because you can't see absolutely what's going on. So you have to trust to a deeper instinct, a deeper sense of self because the maps aren't there. So for me, really in a very real way, imagination, creativity, and forests are bound together in a way that I'll never be able to unweave. And I think that makes me also realize very, very deeply that we need forests in order to be human. That there is something about the depth of who we are as human beings that is dependent on our relationship with these wild places. And think about it. I mean, if, and they will think about it, the technocrats will think about it, if they could replace all the things that forests did, you know, cleaning, you know, transpiring, putting oxygen in, you know, holding on the topsoil, doing all the cleaning and purifying airs and water, if they could find a mechanical way to do that, wouldn't something still be absolutely missing in us? Wouldn't there be a part of us that would be absolutely lost? So it's not this reductionist way that we look at the world is really something that has to be challenged. So that's the first place that I want to look today. So we are always living a story. And the modern worldview story, and you all know it, is one that humans are separate and superior to the earth, right? I love the penetrating myth that Isabella talked about, right? We rape the earth, we spread our seeds, we can control and dominate. And that's the relationship that we have with the earth. You know, Francis Bacon said, let's put the earth, you know, on the rack and torture it for its secrets, you know. This is what it's like. And in this world, therefore, it's absolutely fine to do anything to the rest of the world because the rest of the world is inert. It doesn't have any consciousness, it doesn't have any feeling, and after all, it is just there to support the human drama. So this is a really big problem. And the other thing is that this Western industrial worldview has been transported across the world. And it is such a dominant story. And the thing about a dominant story is that you oftentimes don't realize that you're in it. So it's so big, you can't see it. It's like when you get right up to a mountain, it's really hard to see the mountain. And that's what this story is like. And the other qualities that it holds, this story, is that technology will solve all our problems, that the economy is more important than the environment, that body and mind are split and separate. And when we go to do our work in the world and we meet up with this dominant story, it becomes so much harder to get the things done that we need to do. And think about what we've heard today, just in simple terms of funding. Funding absolutely essential work. But in the modern industrial paradigm story, you know, that fights against us. So we need to change the story, or everything we want to do about revitalizing the earth becomes more and more difficult. And we are teaching this story subtly, perhaps, to our children. We are teaching it in schools. We're teaching it in our history, our curriculum, our geography, our creativity, everything. It permeates the air. So we have to change the narrative. So how do we do that? It's a really big mega narrative. So what I believe passionately is that we need to re-engage our imaginations. You know, Einstein said we cannot solve the problem with the same consciousness that created the problem, nor can we shift the story with the same imagination that created the story. So we have to shift our imagination. And how do we do that in a culture that really tends to think of imagination as something rather foolish and silly? I mean, it's okay for kids, as I've said, to be imaginative, but not necessary for adults. There was a wonderful man called Henri Corbin, who was a 20th century theosopher. So he was born in about 1903 and died in the 1970s. And he coined this term, mundus imaginalis. So he had studied the Sufis, and the Sufis live in all these different realms, and one of them is this imaginal realm, mundus imaginalis, the world of the imagination. And what he said was this world of the imagination lives between two other worlds. On one side, it's the sort of phenomenological world, the embodied world, the world of the senses, right? Which also, as a culture, we don't do so brilliantly with, but still. And on the other side, it was this side of reason and rationality and scientific thought and maths and all of these wonderful kind of ways of measuring and being rational and reasonable about things. And so we lived in these two worlds, but the bridge, he said, between these two worlds was the imagination. And he said that when we really cultivated this imagination, it was as if the soul of the human touched the soul of the earth, the animus mundi. And essentially, in this process of deep imagination, we fell into the dreaming of the earth. The earth was able to dream through us. Now, if any of you are thinking, she certainly lives in California, right? Think about it. Imagination, our human imagination, is an evolutionary event. The reason we have the imaginations we have is because we were birthed into human consciousness during the Cenozoic period. We awoke to self-reflective consciousness in the time of the great flowering of the planet and the birds and the beauty and the greenery and everything going on. What would our imaginations be if we had been born on the moon? Right? Desolate. Desolate. So our imaginations are also entwined with the earth. And the really important thing here, is just for me to turn the page, is to know that imagination has to begin to take center stage in our culture and our work and our schools again. Now, we know indigenous traditional cultures didn't need to think in this kind of way because they were always in a kind of call and response between earth and self, between the places that they lived and their own imaginations. All of their cosmologies were built around relationship to the earth. But we may need a little help. So I think there are three things that we need to look to awaken to the kind of life-giving imagination that is called for in this moment. So the first thing, and this, by the way, I think can be scaled, it doesn't matter, into schools, into corporations, into any system, whatever. Because really, it's not about doing things other than what we're doing, but it's doing it in a different way. So the first thing is apprenticeship. So we are used in the present story that we live in to come at the earth as something that we want to extract information from. We see it as inert, we see it as a resource, we may investigate it, but we don't honor it. But what happens if we shifted that and we went to the earth as we would to an elder, an ancestor? Now we emerged from the earth, we're made of the same stuff as the earth, we are far younger than other earth forms. So what if we decided to go to the earth, whatever we're involved in, with a certain humility, to learn from the earth how she does things? Just a simple shift, but really different. The other thing is attention. So we live in a manically distracted world, manically distracted. And so many wonderful people are starting to write about that. I read a wonderful book by a guy called Nick Carr called The Shallows. And he really talked how in 10, 15 minutes of surfing on the computer, your brain changes. And guess what? You cannot make those deep, intuitive, incredible, radical connections between things that we need to make if you are spending your whole time on the computer. They don't come from those things. So if you send a student out to do a school report and get them to just look up information on a computer, they're just going to regurgitate the same old stuff. Nothing. Their brains are not going to make those amazing kind of leaps of understanding and awarenesses. So we need deep attention. And I hear that they're beginning to teach mindfulness in schools. Are the people hearing that too? And I go, yes. So this deep, deep attention. And it's also an attention that isn't just about measuring and looking at something as sort of subject-object, but this mutual attention. I always love the line of Lawrence Durrell who says, each landscape asks the same thing. I am watching myself in you. Are you watching yourself in me? So as we go into this deep attention, we're also noticing that perhaps many beings are also observing us. And if you've ever been still in a forest, you know exactly what that feels like. So this is a way, and also a way of developing attention is to have a creative practice. I mean, mine is journaling, writing, but I know there are amazing photographers here and artists and dancers and dramatists. And that is so utterly important because it's a way, doing these practices are a way that we cultivate this deep attention, which is so needed. So we have apprenticeship, we have attention, and then we have this activation. Because quite honestly, if we're doing all this stuff and we're not paying attention to how it moves us and changes us and evolves us, and we're going to be talking with some of these amazing young women today about that. If it just stops at the doing and the attention and we don't ask, what am I called forth? I'm being acted upon. To be activated is also to be acted upon, and that's really, really important. And to have space in our curriculum, space in our conversations, to be able to say, you know what happened when I noticed that thing, you know, that bird, that tree, I felt moved. Something stirred in me. I had this idea. I had this thought. Can I tell you about it? Because the circle isn't complete until we begin to express what we are learning through this apprenticeship and attention to the earth. And I know many in this room are doing that and doing it absolutely beautifully. So that's the kind of how we awaken to imagination. We honor it and we create practices and perspectives that allow us to literally, as I say, fall into the dreaming of the earth. And again, Isabella's talk was just that. I mean, listening to the land, allowing it to be what it needs to be to thrive. So different than coming in and saying, this is what I need you to be. Now, when I look at this big modern worldview story that we live in, it's a little freaky and it's very, very big. And I think that's why a lot of us sometimes have these moments of utter despair, like how are we going to do anything about it? And of course, the temptation in our hearts is to meet a very big, bad story with an even bigger but better story, right? We'll just amp up, we'll have this big story, you know, Star Wars all over again, clashing up there in the atmosphere. But I think if we look to forests, we maybe find a different way of telling stories. So what do we know about forests? Diversity is really good. You know, the healthier the forest, the more diverse. I don't think we are moving into the age of one great story. I really don't. I think that age is over. Now, do we all want our stories to end in the same place as a more resilient, vitalized Earth community? Absolutely yes. But how we get there has to be particular. Particular to place, particular to person, particular to perspective. You cannot tell people what story they should be living. You cannot do that. What you can do is seed your story into the world and see what happens. You know, I love the poet W.S. Moen. I don't know if any of you know him, but he's done incredible work of reforesting a whole stretch of land in Hawaii over many, many years. And what he says is that you can plant trees, but you cannot plant a forest, because it's the intelligence of the trees working together with the fungus and the sunlight and the air and the water that creates a forest, right? There is a deeper intelligence at work. So when we begin to seed our stories in the world, and some of them, like seeds, will sit in the dark duff of our souls for decades. Some of them may never see the light of day. But when they do, and when they arise, we cannot know what all these stories working together will create. Right? We cannot know that. But we can know in our deepest being that there is an earth intelligence, I believe, working with us, standing behind the stories that we tell, helping to encourage and give nutrients to the stories that really need to come forward. But we cannot know those stories unless we share these stories, unless we sit in circle. And I mean sitting in circle in school. Can you imagine the end of the day to sit in circle and say, you know, this is what inspired me today. This is who I feel myself becoming today. This is what I learned that touched me today. We need to be vulnerable. We need to be those tender young shoots, saying foolish things, young things, all kinds of extraordinary things, and in the telling, beginning to learn what is really strong, what has its roots deep in something important and vital. And we don't get to do that unless we start speaking my heart to your heart about what matters to us, how we feel in a forest, by a tree, in a meadow, all of those things. We have to come out of the closet, and all of us, in a way, own a little bit of the mystic. I want to share a piece of writing in ending my portion before I get the great delight of hearing from Hannah and Aaron and Nicola and this is a piece of writing by a woman called Linda Hogan. Is anybody familiar with her? Oh, yeah, she's a Chickasaw poet, essayist, and novelist. And her relationship with the land and her writing about the land is so powerful. And I think it's a beautiful, just really example of how we can change and open up to something very, very deep in our writing and working with the earth. And this is from a book called Dwellings, a book of essays, and it's from an essay called Walking. Walking. I can almost hear the redwoods beating, and the oceans are above me here, rolling clouds, heavy and dark, considering snow. On the dry, red road, I pass the place of the sunflower, that dark and secret location where creation took place. I wonder if it will return this summer, if it will multiply and move up to the other stands of flowers in a territorial struggle. It's winter, and there is smoke from the fires. The square lighted windows of houses are fogging over. It is a world of elemental attention, of all things working together, listening to what speaks in the blood. Walking, I am listening to a deeper way. Suddenly, all my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say. Watch and listen. You are the result